the only thing I feel like I can trust, if I can't trust the world out there, is my brain, right? I've got to be able to trust my brain. If my brain is saying it, therefore it must be true and it's part of me. And we get so looped into that if I'm having this thought, then I must be bad and it must be true. And so we get stuck in that thought process and that cycle. And we need to be able to step back from that and see it as a thought.
Welcome to OCD Whisperer Show. Today with me, I have Michelle Massi, who is a licensed marriage and family therapist, and she has been treating OCD for over 15 years. Ms. Massi has a private practice in Los Angeles, where she specializes in CBT to treat OCD, OC spectrum disorders, and other anxiety disorders in children, teens, and adults. Previously, Ms. Massi was the Associate Clinical Director at the UCLA OCD Intensive Treatment Program. She also worked in the UCLA Childhood OCD Anxiety and Tic Disorders Program, as well as their Adult Anxiety Research Program. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So that's amazing. I did not know that you did all of that at UCLA. That's a pretty known program, the UCLA OCD Intensive Treatment one. Yeah.
So I worked in the adult program for 12 years. And then I met the people who run the kid program through that and was working with them for many years and left there to be able to have 2 offices in LA because I couldn't do 2 offices and have 2 clinics at UCLA. But I learned so much from both experiences, both just what life is like in an IOP setting, as well as working with kids versus adults and and the kid clinic, they've got 2 different setups. They've got the IOP and then they have, or actually 3 different setups. They also have a research-based program and then a weekly clinic. And the research-based program is where I primarily worked. And so I got to see treatment and research on OCD, on tic disorder, on family accommodation. And so I learned so much there. It was actually a very good experience.
That's really cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, then you are an incredible person for this. So one of the questions that I have actually comes from a listener, but also, it's really 2 questions, but these questions I find are really something I hear quite often. They're really common, whether through, somebody DMing me or emailing, or just even through seeing clients directly. So the first question that this person had was, is there a difference between automatic and intentional thoughts? Mm-hmm. Is there even such a thing as intentional thoughts? And I'm going to kind of go on a limb here and venture out. Probably this person is speaking about their intrusive thoughts. And I would imagine they're probably nervous around, oh my gosh, did I intend to have that thought? Or is there some secret intention there somehow, which of course, then if you're an OCD person, you immediately are going to go to, oh my God, then that means that's my desire potentially, right. Or I want that, or, right. Oh my gosh, I'm horrible or whatever else. So I'm going to start speaking, but let's hear what you think.
So the first thing I want to point out is some of your listeners have maybe heard this phrase. It's called thought action fusion, where we have a thought and we believe that because we had our thought, either it causes or it makes us that person, right? Because I have the thought, that's typically what we consider a bad thought, it means I'm just as bad as a person who would do those things, right? So if I have the thought, oh my God, what if I, kill you? I'm as bad as a murderer, as opposed to, wow, I had this thought, right? In general, we have thoughts, and I learned a couple of years ago, we have 60,000 thoughts a day, right? And some are very intentional in that, okay, I'm going to sit down, and on Sundays, I sit down and I meal plan for the week. So I very intentionally have thoughts about what I'm going to purchase at the grocery store when I go and what food we're going to eat. Very intentional thoughts about that. On the other hand, I also throughout the day have thoughts that just pop in my head, or they feel like they pop in my head, right? They may be triggered by something and I'm not even aware of it. I talk about that a lot with panic disorder, right? If you and I are sitting here just chatting and all of a sudden your heart starts racing, it feels like it's coming out of nowhere. Whereas if you had just run a mile, you obviously know why your heart is racing. Ultimately, if you do research and education around panic disorder, we actually know our heart is racing as a response to a thought we didn't know we had, but we figured it out. And the same thing with thoughts that feel like pop-ins. One of my colleagues would call them pop-ins, right? A thought, I'm just sitting here talking to you and all of a sudden I have this thought of oh my God, what if I hurt her? Or, oh my God, my hands aren't clean. Or, oh my God, fill in the blank, whatever that what if is. and it feels like it's coming from out of the blue, right? And then we start to, in the same way we do with panic disorders, we start to question, what's wrong with me? Why did I have that thought? What does that say about me? And I always tell my clients, we never do that with quote unquote what we call positive thoughts, right? Only things that we deem negative or bad. So I would never sit here and go, some chocolate ice cream right now. Why am I having that thought right now while I'm talking to Christina, right? Like, why is that thought? What does that say about me that I want chocolate ice cream, right? Now, there's definitely times where we have sort of neutral thoughts where we question why we're having them. Some of my clients with relationship OCD, when they're having sex and they have the thought, oh my God, I need to pick up something from Target, they might start to question that. Even though the Target thought is a neutral thought, they're still thinking, what does that mean? I'm having that during my sexual relationships with my partner. What does that say? Does that mean I don't really love them? Right? So we have all sorts of thoughts throughout the day, and we only really give notice to them when we deem them as bad or negative, right? When we start to judge ourselves. We don't ever question the thoughts that pop in, or even intentional thoughts. I'm never sitting here going, why right now am I thinking about my groceries, right? I'm obviously grocery shopping. So that's we have those good thoughts. Did I answer your question? Did I miss something?
Well, no, I think it's really good in terms of just hearing even globally that kind of the nature of thoughts. I think part of, I guess, if maybe I heard it right, is we do, I guess, maybe have some automatic thoughts that just kind of are there, and we're not always consciously aware of them. And that it sounds like we also do have the capacity to actually intentionally sit down, like you said, and say, okay, I'm going to actually meal prep my kind of grocery list and kind of what I need to get. So both of those occur. And if I heard you right, what you were saying is one of the things as humans, we tend to really overly pay attention to are things that we would consider as, of course, bad, somehow negative. It kind of reminds me of that concept I learned very early on when I started working with this niche in terms of just the evolutionary standpoint, right? That as humans, we're all very negatively biased as it is, because we're always going to be skewed towards looking at anything that could be a threat or a danger to us.
Right.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
And to sort of answer the second part of like, does having a thought cause something, is we talk in our community, I'm sure you've heard about this, right? And some of your listeners have, is the groinal response. If you are to think about, is some part of my body moving right now, right? Just the slight focus on it is going to cause us to feel something, right? And so it's like, okay, our OCD is going to be like, is it the chicken or the egg? And it's going to assume I brought that about, as opposed to I'm thinking about this and therefore this is happening. Now, that's not to say if I think about harming somebody that all of a sudden I'm going to harm them, right? But if is my hand moving, right? And I'm staring at my hand, it's likely to move because I'm staring at it and putting on that concentration, right? I can tell you, of my patients with OCD, they are not more likely to go out and harm somebody or do bad to their community or be labeled with any negative labels, right, than the average population.
Yeah. So I guess kind of one of the things that comes to mind that I'm gonna again assume that this person was kind of asking really, right, is that is there really kind of big difference? And it sounds like, I think part of what I'm kind of thinking is coming up here probably is like, if there is a difference, then how can you really tell like if something is, intentional, meaning like bad or not? Do you have a way to shed some light on that?
There are definitely therapists in the community who will label things as this is your OCD and this is not. I personally don't, because again, then we start to label thoughts as good or bad, right? And instead, if we just see all thoughts as thoughts, right? We're not judging the thoughts, we're mindfully being with them. I'm noticing I'm having this thought, right? Then I can just allow that thought to be there. I don't need to act on that thought. I don't need to question whether or not I'm acting on that thought, right? Or what to do in case I act on that thought, right? A good friend of mine has said, like, don't try and solve a problem that doesn't yet exist. Right. And I use that all the time with my patients. So if I'm sitting here going, oh my God, I have this thought, what happens if I do it? Well, I haven't done it yet. So I don't need to solve that problem. I don't need to figure out whether I'm going to go to jail or I'm going to end up, alone and destitute and childless and all of those things. Right. Because right here, right now, I'm just sitting here talking to you about this podcast. Right. I could have a million and one thoughts that go through my mind and not act on any of them. And I can't tell you which ones I'm going to act on and which ones I'm not going to, right? Now, if we think about it from the standard CBT or cognitive behavioral model, right, is we have thoughts, we have feelings, and we have behaviors. I have zero control over what thoughts pop in my head, and I have zero control over how I feel about something, right? If I tell you, Christina, you should not be anxious about this. It's like, oh, okay, Michelle, right? Or don't be mad at me, right? Like I always tell my clients, you don't get to tell me how I feel. But behavior wise, I have 100% control over how I'm going to act on something, right? So if I have the thought, like, what if this bad thing happens? I have a knife here. What if I pick it up and stab somebody, right? My kid is upstairs. What if I go upstairs and stab him? Or I get 100% control over whether or not I'm going to do anything with that knife, right? And so I have knives all over my kitchen, right? Like a normal average person does, right? I've never done anything with them. And I'm not more likely to do something with them because I have that thought.
Yeah. So we're kind of also getting into a little bit of ERP, right? Conversation. Mm-hmm. And I actually love that you brought this up, because this is also something that I certainly think I've heard people sometimes get kind of confused around things like, first of all, people have this notion like ERP is really scary or can be really tough, which I'm like, well, yes, I guess. And no, sometimes, right? Like it right? Just depends, right? It really does depend, because you can do things really slowly, systematically, step by step. But the other question that comes up that I've also kind of heard people start to ask and wonder, which I think this is just a great segue to ask that, because part of like ERP is, you just said, well, I know that I didn't do that, right? But then OCD is always going to come back, of course, because that's what it does. And oh my God, but what if this time? Or, okay, well, maybe you didn't then, but you're going to now. So this whole concept of living with that, right? Because the whole thing of ERP has always been, an OCD treatment for the longest time is about uncertainty and entertaining kind of that, you may not know the answer to that right away, or you may never know 100%, but, are you willing to kind of live with having that be there, but really come back to this moment, right? And kind of be here. Right. Is that kind of, because then that kind of, I think people get confused, right? Because it sounds like that we are having some certainty, but then we're talking about embracing uncertainty.
Right.
Yeah. So,
well, what I tell my clients is the only two things you can be certain of, actually, there's really three, right? Are death, taxes, and what already happened in the past, right? I know for a fact that I was 2 minutes late for us chatting, right? At 4:58, I couldn't have told you I was going to be 2 minutes, right? So I have to deal with that uncertainty until it happens, right? Am I concerned that I will ever stab my child? No, right? I really don't believe can I be certain it won't happen? No, I mean, accidents happen, right? Like, how many new parents have ever said, like, I am going to be 100% certain I will never drop my child? I'll tell you, hopefully my mother-in-law doesn't kill me for sharing this story. She always tells the story of like, she was a pediatric nurse when my husband and her kids were young. And she had the kids at Disneyland one day in like old school stroller, right? Was pushing my youngest brother-in-law, and he slid out of the stroller and she rolled over him, right? Here you've got this like PICU nurse who knows how to handle it, right? And totally rolling over her, right? And so it's like, look, can I promise I'm never going to harm my child? I mean, ideally not intentionally, right? But I don't know about the future, right? And do I ever think I would stab somebody? No, but look, this mama bear is going to protect her child. And if somebody were to come, not just someone threaten my child, but like really like hurt my child, right? Like can't quite, I'm not concerned that I'm going to all of a sudden going to lose it, right? And I think this is where like, I don't need to get into a debate with my mind of like, will this happen or won't this happen? I don't know the future. And if instead I focus on right here, right now, right, then I don't really need to get into that discussion. Again, I don't need to solve a problem that doesn't yet exist. I haven't yet stabbed somebody, so I don't need to worry about whether or not I'm going to.
That's great. So then what would you say, like, for folks who maybe are doing like imaginal exposure scripts, right? Because some of that concept is actually, taking your fear and kind of taking it all the way. And I will put a disclaimer here. I personally loved imaginal scripts. They helped me tremendously before I learned any other therapy modalities for OCD. That was one of my first kind of things or exposure practices to just kind of write it all out all the way in. And again, not everybody, right? Because some people, and I've also had clients who
100%.
didn't really like it, didn't resonate with it as much, right? So
Right.
it goes to speak that there is an individual kind of process with this. But what would you say to that then? Does that kind of might not kind of go together?
Yeah. So I think first off, when I'm doing exposure work, right? My job is to challenge my clients to sort of go beyond what we consider, normal, right? And we're doing that so that they can see that either the bad thing doesn't happen or they can handle the bad thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not. I'm trying to give an example. Like my child the other day decided to lick. Where were we? We were at some restaurant. He decides he's going to lick the chair, right? Oh, gross, right? And also, okay, whatever, right? Now, I'm not asking like my average person that we should all do this, right? But, and I'm not necessarily saying I do that in session, right? Because some people would say that's like more on the extreme end. But I'm definitely going to push my clients past sort of where they normally challenge themselves. The way I compare it is like when you're working out with a trainer at the gym, right? When I would work out by myself and I would get tired, I'd be like, I'm okay. I don't need one more set, right? But my trainer is going to push me. And the same thing when you're doing exposures and working with a therapist is we're going to kind of go above and beyond a little bit to where you're at, with the idea that if you can do that, then you can kind of live within that normal range, right? And I don't need to freak out that my child, he could get sick, right? But I don't need to really freak out about that. With imaginal exposures, like you said, it doesn't work for all my clients. I've used them for many, many years. And I've sort of changed how I do them from when I was first trained to how I do them now. But again, because I'm doing sort of above and beyond, then writing out that script where like this bad thing might happen, that's different than just like sitting there and ruminating in my obsessions and where that gets in the way of my functioning, right? When I'm purposely setting aside time, to do an exposure versus like I should be studying right now. Instead of studying, I'm worrying about whether I'm going to go upstairs and take a knife to my child, right?
Yeah. So what would you say, like if somebody, I could imagine anybody listening right now, right, and they're might be thinking, well, what do I do if I'm having, some of those really difficult, again, all OCD is difficult, but there are some topics that of course are, more taboo that kind of have just a ton more kind of guilt and shame
Stigma.
associated and stigma 100%, right? So what would you say for that?
In terms of like how they do exposures or
like what would they then, because we're talking about like, part of ERP is like knowing like, okay, I didn't do anything with kids, or I'm not doing anything with family members, or I never had the desire. Like we talk about ego dystonic, right? Which I mean, in there, interestingly enough, is a clue. Right. But of course, like all the traditional training never quite addressed that. And I think, we're in general in therapy are evolving a bit more and kind of understanding, other nuances, right? So like something like that, then what would you say? Because again, this is like, somebody listening, I could imagine somebody being a little bit kind of pausing, going, wait a second. So do I then entertain the certainty but then I still have the thought. So how do I do the imaginal?
Right. So when I originally trained in OCD treatment back in, like 2004, 2005, whatever, is I would have done an imaginal script for it, right? And written out there. And I've also found as time has gone on that sometimes people get stuck in ruminating and it actually doesn't serve as a good exposure, right? So I might change, instead of sitting there and doing an imaginal script, I might do things a little bit differently. Like I love using Mad Libs for that, right? So they'll like write out a Mad Libs about like, using words around murder and knife or whatever their taboo subject is, right? And kind of interspersing them. I did one with one of my clients. This was one of my favorite exposures I did. We wrote out Little Red Riding Hood and randomly replaced words in Little Red Riding Hood with their trigger words. right? So we're still doing, in a sense, an imaginal script. It just looks a little different than like where I was initially trained. The flip side is also stopping the avoidance, which is what we see a lot with all of these, taboo kind of obsessions is, I'm not going to be around kids if I have thoughts about harming kids or doing inappropriate things to kids, or I might, avoid going certain places for certain reasons, right? And so instead of avoiding is not necessarily going out of your way to be somewhere you don't need to be, but making sure to incorporate those things back in your life, right? I had clients who like refused to babysit family members anymore once they had thoughts, right? Or they wouldn't change diapers, right? So engaging them, if that's in their world, is going back and doing those behaviors and not being ultra careful, right? Doing it kind of the average way, the normal way that another person would do it. So it's more focusing on getting back into life as opposed to maybe, everything can be an exposure, or anything can be an exposure, right? So it's just kind of getting back into life. Back to your question of like living with that uncertainty is that I don't need to sit there. Or I don't need to have my clients sit there going, oh my God, didn't die. It's like, I don't know if I did or not. And right now I'm doing the dishes. So I'm going to focus on doing the dishes. I don't need to have this argument.
Got it. So just like before, we might have done hot words or like a full script. So again, depending on the person, that may be relevant or it may not. And it may be like you just said, finding other creative ways of being around hot words or around the topic, but not avoiding it. So you can keep kind of allowing your brain to learn like, hey, look at what I'm actually doing though.
Right.
Versus getting caught up in the mind, of course. And anybody with OCD listening, we all know, we all compulsively ruminate sometimes.
Exactly.
Okay. So my last question for you is, and I kind of went a little off topic from the questions this person posed, but one of them was, how can you manage the guilt associated with having what you perceive to be a thought you intentionally or deliberately thought about?
Right.
And I think there's a couple of things in this question, and I do want to kind of tease it apart in two steps. I think one is, I think globally, I'd love to just have you share with us a little bit about, how does somebody, manage those kind of feelings? But I think the second question here is, kind of like, when you're perceiving a thought that you had to be intentional, right? So we want to be clear, folks, that,
right.
Well, I'm going to let you answer, Michelle, but you understand where I'm going with this.
Yeah, exactly. And feel free to follow up if I miss something. So one thing is guilt and shame come from a place of judgment, right? Either I'm judging myself based on the shoulds I believe I should have, or based on what I think society believes, right? And especially with so many of the taboo subjects of OCD, which is where we get, so many ruminations is, am I a bad person for having these thoughts, right? And so I'm going to judge myself because I know if you knew what I was thinking about, you'd absolutely judge me. And to some degree, it's true, right? When some of my patients have shared the information with people in their inner circle, people respond with, oh my God, I can't believe you have that thought. That's so weird or whatever. Right. And so then we get that feedback from the world of like, oh my God, I must be a bad person. Right. And so we start judging ourselves. If we can again recognize and step back, use a little bit of ACT and cognitive diffusion and noticing that we're having these thoughts as opposed to, let me back up a second. When we have a thought, we tend to believe it because it's coming from our brain and we buy into that thought because the only thing I feel like I can trust if I can't trust the world out there is my brain, right? I've got to be able to trust my brain. If my brain is saying it, therefore it must be true and it's part of me. And we get so looped into that if I'm having this thought, then I must be bad and it must be true. And so we get stuck in that thought process and that cycle. And we need to be able to step back from that and see it as a thought. And again, I go to a more neutral or what we might think of as like positive thoughts. And if I had the thought, I feel like some chocolate ice cream tonight for dessert, right? I'm not going to feel any guilt and shame around that unless I have, body image and eating disorder concerns as well, right? But generally speaking, or like if I say, oh, I want to see Barbie this weekend, I'm not going to sit there and judge myself. Why would I want to see Barbie? Like, what does that say about me? Right. And so it's where we question these things and where we judge ourselves for having these thoughts. Right. And the reality is that every human has negative thoughts, or what we quote on negative thoughts, right? Whether it's about ourselves, whether it's about somebody else, we have so many biases. And I think that's a word. There's, and, in the last couple of years, even recognizing in myself, like things that I don't necessarily want to think about, but recognize that my brain is thinking about, right? And some of it has come from the environment in which I've grown up in, or beliefs I've had, or beliefs those around me have had, and just allowing that thought to be there and recognizing and not necessarily judging myself for that thought, and recognizing you mentioned something about ego dystonic, right? And ego syntonic is that if something doesn't align with my values, A, I don't need to act on it, and B, I can start to educate myself about how to learn otherwise, right? And I'm sort of talking more globally, right? If I have thoughts about, let's see, what somebody looks like, for example, or where somebody was born and raised, right? Is that, if I'm like, oh, those thoughts that I'm having don't align with who I want to be, then I get to go educate myself on that, right? So really taking a step back when we start to judge ourselves for these thoughts, and recognizing that everybody has intrusive thoughts, right? They might not be the same, but everybody has intrusive thoughts, right? And so it's like, I believe, we get into the mind reading, that if you knew exactly what I was thinking, you judge me. But the reality is that you might be thinking something similarly, or something, quote unquote, negatively as well. And recognizing that we're human, right? And we need to have some self-compassion for ourselves.
Yeah. So kind of, if I may, part of what I'm hearing you say
Mhm.
in terms of that management, and I kind of come back to this a lot, is one, self-awareness. Two is, of course, being, self-compassionate, which really means being kinder to yourself and how you talk to yourself.
Yeah.
And it sounds like three, it is changing that inner conversation,
Yeah.
so that you're not, kind of letting that inner critic, if you will, right, badger yourself and beat yourself up, but actually be able to come back and reconnect to that perspective and awareness and recognition of what is actually happening.
Yeah.
Very on point. All right. Thank you so much. I really
You're
appreciate your
welcome.
time and just kind of getting into this. I know there's a lot of conversations out there about different modalities, and I think it's just important that we keep having conversations,
Yeah.
and, for people to continue to learn and to know that, nobody's doing anything wrong. Just learn the different things, do whatever feels
Yep.
good for you or resonates, because most importantly, it's just about getting better.
Right. Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So what would be one thing that you would like to leave our listeners with?
Oh my God. Great question. And I always hate that question. Um, just know that you're not alone, right? So many of our patients, you and I just got back from the conference this year, and it's amazing how many people have never met somebody else who has OCD, who suffers with OCD, never talked to anybody. And just know that there's a community out there. I mean, social media has made it so much easier because we can find other people who are struggling. There's Reddit, discussions, there's TikToks on it, there's, Instagram handles. And so people have been able to, but it's just know that you're not alone, and that there is help out there, and to reach out to somebody that you feel that you can trust or feel safe to you, because there's information, right? And you can get help, and you can find support, and you can find a community to connect with.
Amazing. I think that message needs to be said 1,000 times over. So how can anybody find you if they'd like to find you?
Yes. My website is anxietytherapyla.com. That's the best place. I have a social media, and I post on my social media as I feel fit. I try not to get into like, I have to post. So I'll go through phases where I'll post a ton and then not at all. So I'm not super active, but you can find me on Instagram under Anxiety Therapy LA. Yeah, my website is typically, and then random things like podcasts and whatnot.
I love it. Well, thank you
Yes.
so much.
Thank you for having me.